welcome everybody. My name's Marnie and I'd like to welcome you to Frankston City Libraries today for our Frank Talk with Karen Turner. Now, before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Frankston City Libraries operates, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge the elders of any other communities who may be joining us today. Now, today we do have Karen Turner, which I'm really excited about. We're celebrating her third novel. If you do have any questions for Karen today, there is a chat function just down the bottom. So if you hover over the bottom, there'll be a little chat and you can write your questions in there and I'll be able to read those out to Karen once we've heard from her. So I will hand over to Karen and please make her welcome.
Hi everyone, and thanks so much to Frankston for having me today. It's a great opportunity. The problem with being a writer is that you spend a lot of time in a solitary environment hanging out with imaginary friends, imaginary landscapes, imaginary houses. I hear voices in my head. Take that however you want to take that. But to be able to actually chat with people, it's a really exciting thing. I'm just going to change my view because I've got myself on the big screen and I really don't need to see myself on the big screen, so I'll just put you, Marnie, on the big screen. It's nicer. Okay, so thank you for having me. Today I'd like to talk about my books. As Marnie said, I've got 3 books out. The first one is Torn, and the sequel is Inviolate, and the third one is Stormbird. Now, Stormbird can be read independently, but I wrote them as a trio, so I really would like them read as a trio, but they don't have to be read as a trio. Stormbird can be read individually. For me, my background is English and Italian. My father's family is Italian and my mother's family is from England, particularly Yorkshire. I spent some time in my early 20s living in Yorkshire with my grandma in a country village called Otley. And as anybody who's been to that part of the world, they call it God's own country because Yorkshire is beautiful. And I fell in love with the houses and the landscapes and the history. You know, England particularly bombards you with history. So a story was brewing in my head, and over the years it germinated and came to life. And it was only about 10 years ago that I actually decided that I would write it down. And the result was Torn. Now, Torn tells the story of a young girl growing up in a house on the outskirts of Leeds, and it is actually the village where I lived, although I call it Woolston in my story. It is Otley. You can find it on the map. Beautiful place. Torn tells the story of a young girl. It's set during the Napoleonic times, so think Regency, and it's a time when social etiquette was very important and young women didn't actually have a lot of the freedoms that we take for granted these days. So my character was young and gently raised, quite naive and very sheltered, as a lot of girls were in those days. And as she starts to grow up a little bit, she starts to realise that the world has a lot of opportunities for her brothers that she doesn't have. For example, her brothers get to go to university and be educated. They also join the war and go and fight against Napoleon, and that has its own consequences, which we explore in the book. She's from a blended family. Her mother remarries and brings a stepbrother and stepsister into the story, and that also has an impact on her young life. So she falls in love with a very inappropriate person, but she's betrothed off to marry somebody equally inappropriate. Well, in her opinion, he's inappropriate. So this is a coming of age. This is a story of Alexandra and how she starts to see the world isn't the sort of place that she thought she would like it to be. It's a very different place from the world that her brothers inhabit. Inviolate is the sequel. It moves straight from Torn. And this is, Alexandra's older now, and I was able to explore some more adult themes in this book. Alexandra has grown up a lot. She's realised that the world can have some some things, some elements that she doesn't particularly like, and some parts of it are dangerous, some very confronting. And for me as a writer, I really, really enjoyed writing this because I'd grown up with Alexandra as she grew up in Torn. I'd grown up as a writer to be able to explore these more adult themes and the consequences that these themes had for Alexandra and the impact that they had on her life. And to be honest with you, when I was writing a lot of these themes and the things that happened to Alexandra, I didn't see coming, you know, because when you get so absorbed in your writing, the characters seem to take on a life of their own, and I just sort of let them run with it. And the result was this entire life that Alexandra has. And I guess you'll just have to read the book to find out how they resolve themselves. But I have to say that I had a wonderful time writing these. And over the years, I have visited Otley, the village in these books, many, many times. In fact, my husband proposed to me in a pub in that village. And, you know, even last Christmas I spent there. I feel very, very close to this village, and which brought me to writing Stormbird, which was the third one in the series. Now, Stormbird is a leap in time because Torn and Inviolate take place during the Regency period. But this actually takes place in the same house that Alexandra lived in, but during World War II. And the reason why I chose this was because I had a wealth of information that just seemed to be the right fit, because my mother was born in Yorkshire, 1941, and that's when this book is set. And this book tells the story of Jessica, who now lives in the house that Alexandra lived in over 100 years earlier. And Jessica is a war widow. She's young. She's raising 2 children on her own. She's got a small dairy farm that she's earning a bit of income from. But a German fighter pilot is shot down near her home, and the authorities know he's out there, but he's hiding in her barn. And when Jessica discovers him there, you can imagine in a time of war when harbouring the enemy was as bad as being the enemy, it opened up quite a moral dilemma for Jessica and how she would deal with it. But her attitude was basically, well, I lost my husband to the war. If a German lady had found him, would I want her to look after him? And that was the moral dilemma. And so she chose to look after this German. And of course, with the authorities on her trail, they know he's out there. They just don't know where, but they start to suspect Jessica knows something. And I'm not going to go into that because my husband actually says this is his favourite. He could be biased, I mean, who knows. But it does, as a writer, I loved it. I was able to explore a lot of themes of love and the budding romance and breaking down these barriers of ignorance and bigotry that war can create. Between Jessica and Anton, I develop a love. It is essentially a love story, but it's also an adventure and a drama because there's the constant threat of the authorities that are chasing him down. And if they catch him, it won't be good for him or her because, you know, she's basically being a traitor to her country by looking after him. Stormbird also, interestingly enough, the publisher that looked after Torn and Inviolate for me was no longer around. So I started the hunt for a publisher for Stormbird. And as luck would have it, Stormbird was picked up by a publisher in the UK in the village next door to where this was set. So this is a nice, cool little synergy there. Stormbird also was shortlisted for the Romance Writers of Australia Emerald Crow Award a couple of years ago. So it's been very, very well received, and I'm a bit chuffed about that. I think that it has appealed to me as a writer to write things that were set in the UK because, as I said, I really fell in love with the landscape. But my next book will be set in Australia. I think I do have to be a little bit more loyal to my roots. And I'm setting a book that will be set in the Victorian goldfields. So a little bit of research there because it's not something I've written before. Everything I've been inspired to write has been UK based, but I love history. It'll definitely be historical. regardless. So any questions for me, Marnie? Anything you'd like to talk about?
Well, you did touch on your publishing story, and I know that when we do these author talks, we end up with quite a number or a large proportion of our attendees are writers themselves or aspiring writers. So can you give us a little bit of insight into your publishing story, you know, for those first two books, and then how it felt having to go out and find a second publisher for your third, Stormbird?
Sure. A little bit of a story. At the time when I first started writing, I was the vice president of the Society of Women's Writers in Victoria, and we would have a guest speaker every month, and we still do. And one particular month, a publisher came along to have a chat, and he was one of the boutique publishers who his main focus was literary text, but he would take on a little bit of fiction from time to time. So I got chatting with him and said, "Oh, I've written a book," and blah, blah, blah. And he wanted to see it, and that was torn. So he said, "Yeah, we can publish this, but it will essentially be self-published." So that was fine. I was, you know, I had complete control over what I could do with it. I did argue, his name was Paul, I did argue with him about the cover, because all the while I was, you can see that there, all the while I was writing Torn, I knew about the oak tree. I had it in my head. I knew what this book was going to look like. So when I chatted to Paul, even though I was self-publishing, and that gives you a lot of freedom, he said, no, the cover won't work. You tell us what design you think you'd like. And I said, no, I know what it's going to look like. And I argued back and forth. Because I was self-publishing, it gave me that freedom to turn around and say to him, do the cover my way or not at all. And so he backed down and we published it. And he very graciously gave me some feedback from quite a few people who contacted him and said, love the cover, bought the book just because of the cover. So when it came time to publishing in Violate, you'll notice it's the same tree. That's actually a tree in Russia. The photographer took photos of this tree at different times of day, different seasons, from the same spot. So I have these two photos, one in autumn, one in winter. And so when it came time to publishing in Violate, I had no argument from the publisher about the cover. However, he did say to me he was so impressed with book sales and how well it went that he would like to reprint Torn under his imprint and then do In Violate under his imprint. So it turned out that In Violate wasn't going to be self-published, but I was able to maintain enough control over it because you often lose that when you go with a traditional publisher. Now, I wouldn't like to call it a sad comment about my book sales, but the publisher doesn't exist anymore. How can I blame myself? But it did mean that I had to go out and find another publisher when I was ready to publish Stormbird, which is why Stormbird looks so different in, you know, size and shape and whatever. But you'll notice it's the same tree.
Oh!
And I had an argument all over again. I had to argue with the publisher because this was a traditional publisher, and basically you sign away your baby. I've written this baby, I've got it to the best that I can, and then you send it out into the wide world and someone else takes control of it. For me, the benefit was I didn't have to pay, but I completely lost control. With Paul, even though we signed on his imprint, I had a lot of control, but I lost complete control with Stormbird, which as a control freak, it didn't sit well. But I got it done and it looks really nice. I did argue my case with the cover again because I wanted that connectivity between the three books. Even though they're set in a different time, there is the running theme of Alexandra living in the house, even in Stormbird. The girl from the previous two books still makes an appearance and there's a diary and you just got to read it. But yeah, it was great having the traditional publisher. So when people often ask the question, is it better to go traditional to self-publish? Look, there are pros and cons for both. The best advantage with self-publishing is that you have control. The advantage with traditional publishing is all financial. But yeah, that's how it worked out. It was a long slog though, a lot of rejection letters, a lot of putting it out there. I have to tell you, they say that there is a way to pitch to a publisher, and it's like a job interview. You've got your cover letter, everything's got to be so, polite. It's got to be driven to a specific formula, and you do this and you do that. And at the time, I was living in Rome, and I was on my own, and I was sending out all these pictures and getting back all these rejections. And then one day I just thought, oh, damn this, I've had enough. And I just broke all the rules, and I wrote this letter to a publisher. And I was rude, I was cheeky, I was flippant, and I fully expected a rejection. And he came back within hours and said, I want to talk to you, and then invited me for lunch. And as it turned out, he was just up the road from where the books were set. And I met him for lunch in a pub that I used to eat at when I lived over there. So there you go.
Well, it just shows sometimes your spunk does pay off.
And persistence. If I have one word of advice for anybody pitching to publishers or agents, persistence. It's the most important thing.
Absolutely. We keep on using the J.K. Rowling example. But, if she had have given up, Harry Potter wouldn't exist for the world. That's
right. And she was rejected by 30, 40 times, something like that. It's incredible. I heard about someone else, I can't remember who it was now, someone well known, it's gone out of my head, rejected so many times. And it's crazy. Charles Dickens, constantly rejected. And where would we be without Dickens?
That's it. And I find, so I'm an aspiring writer myself, which is why I've got a little bit of an insight into it. But I find when looking at publishers, depending on what time of year it is, depends on what they're looking for. So they might have enough of children's books or enough of romance or enough of crime, and they're just not looking for that at that time. But in 18 months' time, they might be. So it really does pay off.
That's exactly right. But also the genres that they pick too. Like I've had so many, you see so many publishers and agents saying, yes, we're looking for new talent, but please no more vampires.
Absolutely. And now Tamara has asked a question. She'd like to ask about your research and how much research goes into each book. And do you do it all before you start writing each book, or do you do it as you go along?
It's an interesting question because, as I mentioned, I was living in the UK when I had all these wonderful ideas for a book. But there is an awful lot of research goes into it, and there are areas of research you do that you have no previous knowledge that you're going to do. For example, in Born and Inviolate, in the day it was fashionable for young men to wear a sword, a dress sword, and that's why the young men were called blades. We call them blokes these days, but they used to call them blades. And the young blades used to get around with this dress sword on. And I thought, well, what does that actually feel like? What do they look like? Are they heavy? What do they do? Surely they get in the way. So I had to do a lot of research on how heavy they were, how long they were, what they looked like, how ornate they were. And for no good reason. I actually didn't use that research at all, except to understand how it might make somebody walk. Or, when he was taking off his sword belt, did he just fling it away, or did he have to, there's how that would make the body move, because I have to paint a picture for my readers based on what I see in my head, but I can only paint that picture in words. So I need to be able to see it, to put it into words so that my readers can see it too. So I had to know what these swords were like. With my next book, because it's going to be set in Australia, I need to do a lot of research around Australia in that time during the gold rush. I know nothing about it other than what I learned at school. So, for example, how did they wash their clothes back on the gold fields, or did they not? How did they wash themselves? I'm guessing they didn't. What did they eat? Where did they buy the clothes from? Where did they buy the food from? Where did they get their tools from? I'm guessing that they had very entrepreneurial hardware stores back in the day. But I need to know these things because I might not use that information in the book, but I need to put myself in that place. And so there is some research that I can do beforehand because I know I'm going to need it. And then there's research that I'll need along the way because I'll be writing something and then I'll think, gee, how long would it take to ride a horse from Melbourne to Ballarat? So, you need to do the research along the way as well. Now, my husband's very clever. He's very good at Googling, so he does a lot of research for me. Other stuff, you just ask questions, you go and visit historical societies, you go and talk to people, you go to libraries and ask librarians, because we all know that you guys know so much stuff. And if you don't have the answer, you know where I can find it. So there are always people to ask and places to go. But it's a constant thing when you're writing, which is why it takes me 4 to 5 years to write a book.
Wow, and that was going to be my next question, was the process itself in writing. I know a lot of people have very different ways of going about it. And if you're saying 3 or 4 years to write a book, do you sit down and plan what that book's going to look like, or are you a pantser? Do you just let it evolve and write it and have it change as you go?
It's a bit of both. I have a general idea in my mind. I know a lot of writers plot and they write. I know one particular writer, a very famous guy, he books out a hotel room and covers the walls in butcher's paper with his plot, and then he moves it around until he knows what he's doing. I don't do that because I see it in my head like a movie. So I just start writing, but then things change and characters take on their own lives and develop and go off and do things that I don't see coming. And so it's constantly evolving. I have a basic story. I know how it's going to start. It's like you've got little milestones along the way, and they're the big events in the story. So I've got all of those, and I've got the end. But the story is what links all the milestones, and they're the things that you don't quite have, or I don't quite have. So I have, this is going to happen here, and that's going to happen there, and then there'll be that, and then there'll be that, and it'll end here. But the bits that join all of that is what I don't know, and that's what I write. And that's why a writer will always say to aspiring writers, just start writing. Don't think it out too much. Just start, because you'll be amazed at how much you get rid of later on. Stormbird, for example, started out over 200,000 words, and now it's down to about 180,000, because you write it and then you go, okay, that has to come out, that has to come out, and that has to come out. So the rule is, if the reader is not going to lose out by you taking that bit out, then take it out. Because if the reader doesn't gain anything or it doesn't add to the story, it's got to go. And it's a very hard rule. You've heard of killing your darlings, and that's basically what it is. You've got to be cutthroat. So yeah, I know my story, but I write it all down, and there are times when I look at that and think, oh, that's the best piece of prose that's ever been written. And then there are times when I think, that's really embarrassing, that's got to go. So yeah, it's just, you just start writing and let it flow, and then yeah, you know what's going to happen, you know where it's going to end up, but you pull a lot back as well.
Absolutely. Now, if anyone has any questions for Karen, please pop them in the group chat and I'll be able to read them out to her. Now, you do have your new novel coming out, set in the goldfields. Can you give us a little bit of an insight? Other than that, are we looking at another romance? What are we looking at?
Well, you're looking at a romance. That's what I like. I don't write fluffy stuff. I have to say I do love a good bodice ripper from time to time, but I don't write that. I like really good, solid historical stuff. So the next book is going to be set in Victorian goldfields. It's going to trace the story of a lady whose husband has abandoned her to go off and try seek his fortune in goldfields. And she's in Melbourne, and she journeys to Ballarat because basically, and it happened a lot. It happened a lot where men would leave their families to go and go digging for gold and become rich. But what they didn't realise was that the mother and the child, or the children, were left almost homeless. A lot of them, the source of income was gone. And in many cases, these men weren't finding the gold on the goldfields, so the women were destitute. And so you had crime, you had prostitution, you had all sorts of things going on. So my character, her husband has done that. He's abandoned her. He's taken off up to the goldfields. She stayed in Melbourne for as long as she could, and then she and her daughter have travelled up to Ballarat to meet up with him, and the story will go from there. It's an adventure. We have the Eureka Stockade. It's around that time, and basically what happens and how she survives, and that's why I need to know about what life was really like. living in that canvas village.
And I guess it's hard when you're actually writing about, like in your former novels, when you're writing about a place that's real, you've got to get it right.
Yes, because there's always somebody to say, oh, it didn't happen that way. So, you know, when you get feedback, I got some feedback from a lady who lived in the UK during the war, and she'd read Stormbird, and she sent me an email to tell me that, she said, oh, your history, your research was spot on. It was wonderful. It's just as I remembered. And that is so rewarding.
Phew.
Oh, thank goodness for that. But I did have a lady one day that I was really angry about, who reviewed a copy, one of my copies of Porn, and there's a dog in it that wears a collar, and she made a big song and dance on the internet about how my research wasn't up to par because everybody knew dogs didn't wear collars in those days. And I thought, well, hang on a minute, they wore them in ancient Egypt, so I'm pretty sure they wore them in the UK 200 years ago. But, you know, so yeah, you've got to get it right. And
yeah, absolutely.
I'm a little bit concerned about the Australian one because I grew up with my mother and my grandmother speaking the Yorkshire dialect, and I understand it. I can speak some of it. There's a little bit of it in Stormbird because it was real. So all my books set in the UK are authentic. The language is authentic. The dialect's authentic. It's all in English, I have to point out, but it's traditional English, the way English people speak it and how they spoke it in that day. For me now, writing in the Australian goldfields, I have no idea how they spoke. So that's going to be a whole lot of research. Yeah, I know there were a lot of Irish people, there were a lot of Welsh people and English and Scottish, there were some Asian people, there's a lot of different cultures all mixing together on the goldfields. But, you know, what was slang? You know, how did they speak and what words did they use? So that's a lot of research I'm going to have to do.
I can imagine you spending quite a bit of time up at Sovereign Hill once we're allowed back in.
Yes, and I do love Sovereign Hill, so I will definitely be there.
Yeah, you're definitely transporting me back to like grade 5 camp at Sovereign Hill. So. Now, Heather has asked, who are your favourite authors?
Okay, well, one of my very favourite authors, you've probably never heard of, was a lady called Pamela Bell. She was an English writer. She's still alive and she does the author talk circuit, but she's not writing anymore, which I think is a crime against humanity. She probably inspired me more than anybody to write the sorts of books that I do, because she writes very well researched historical fiction set in the UK around the British Civil War, that kind of time. And she is my favourite author. But I also love Diana Gabaldon, because we all love Outlander, don't we? And I love Philippa Gregory, those kinds of authors. But I do mix it up from time to time. I've read quite a lot of Stephen King. I like the old biography from time to time, autobiographies, some of the hair bands and rock stars. I've got a lot of those books. You know, Motley Crue and Kiss and, oh, good heavens, how embarrassing. But yeah, so I'll pretty much read anything, but if I'm going to read for pleasure, it's a historical fiction. I love with a bit of romance, a bit of drama, a bit of family drama, all that kind of stuff.
Heather actually just said, I loved Pamela Bell's books. It's been years since I read them.
Thank you, Heather. You're the first person I've ever met who's read them. And my favourite, The Moon in the Water and The Chains of Fate. Oh, wow, yeah. Yeah, so glad to find somebody else who appreciates Pamela Bell.
So awesome. Now, Vivian has also asked a question. She said, do you have a set writing schedule? Some authors have a certain number of pages or word count they want to meet each day. And where do you find you are the most productive when you write?
Okay, not at home. I find it very difficult to write at home. I have no children. I have a couple of cats and a husband, but they don't bother me so much. I have my own office space, but I find it very difficult because I get distracted. There's always some housework to be done, or there's always something, there's a phone ringing, there's something. So I've been finding lately, because I'm writing the book set in Australia, well, until lockdown, I was taking myself off to Beechworth every day, or every Friday morning, and that was my treat. Friday morning, I'd sit in Beechworth Bakery.
I was going to say the bakery.
Yeah, the bakery, because I live 20 minutes from there, so it's perfect. I'd sit there with my laptop, my coffee, my bushman's pasty, and I would sit there and I'd do some solid writing. When I was writing Torn and Inviolate and Stormbird, I actually spent a lot of time in Rome, and I would just pack up and go to Rome for 3 months at a time, leave the husband and everybody behind, and just set myself up in an apartment. And I did some volunteer work at an animal shelter while I was there. And it's what I do. I'd be there now, but we're not allowed to. But I do find I have to take myself out of my environment and away from distractions, and that includes friends and family. If I'm going to write, I have to clear my decks. I have to make sure there is nothing to be done. Everything has to be up to date, even, you know, the washing, the shopping, the cats need to have been fed, everything. And then I can focus on writing. And then I can lose a day. I can start writing in the daylight and suddenly it's cold and it's dark and my office is dingy and it's like my husband's looking for his dinner and I've lost a whole day. I don't write to a certain number of words. And that's because it's very hard when you're writing historical fiction. You never know what research you're going to need. So I might be writing a couple of thousand words one day and it all flows nicely, and then the next day I'll write 200 words and realise that there's this important piece of research and I can't proceed without it. So it can be very sporadic. I do try to write every day. It doesn't always happen that way. My perfect environment is to get away from home. No friends, no family, no distraction, and just physically take myself away from my environment.
Oh, sounds good. Now, we'll say if anyone's got any other questions, pop them in the chat. Now, Karen's books are available via our Cloud Library app. So you can access that for free with your Frankston City Library's membership. And I know we've just grabbed a copy of Stormbird. So when the library opens again, we will have it to physically borrow. And you can also purchase Karen's books via karenturner.com.au. And that's the ebooks and the physical paperbacks. Now, has anyone got any other questions? No, not by the looks of it. Okay, well, thank you very much, Karen, for joining us today. We've really appreciated it. Now, everyone, virtual clap. Join me in thanking Karen. Kind of one of those
virtual bow.
Yeah, we're also. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, we have a heap of authors coming up and workshops, so please just keep checking our website and our Facebook page to see what we've got coming up. Everyone, please keep safe, look after each other, and we'll see you when our libraries reopen. So thank you again. Thanks so much, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.